okay, you can go around and you can say that a hot dog is a sandwich, but you're not going to get hired by anybody. That's just the reality.
That's fair enough.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Hail State Debate. This is the first video for our new YouTube channel talking about high school debate topics to try to help out folks out there who do debate and enjoy it like we do. Let me quickly introduce you to everybody. My name is Brett Harvey, and I am the debate coach here at Mississippi State. With me, I have Josh McCoy, one of our ace varsity debaters and former PF debater in high school, very good. And also our ace novice here, Luke Acuff. And this is the first video for our new channel. It's sort of a pilot for us. It's the first topic we're tackling, and it's a really important one. It's the NSDA Nationals topic in public forum debate, which is...
on balance, the benefits of United States participation in the North American Free Trade Agreement outweigh the consequences. Basically, what we're going to be doing in today's video is outlining a couple of the basic key things you need to know going into this topic, how to frame some of the arguments. I'm going to be representing the pro side of today's debate. Luke is going to be representing the con side.
Yeah, and so if you're watching this, first of all, congratulations. It means you've either qualified for NSDA, which is a huge accomplishment, so good job. Or, even if not, maybe you're just watching this trying to learn how to get better at PF debate, and that's great too, and that's something to be congratulated. So good job. As in debate, I guess we're kind of just going to jump right into it.
Exactly.
The order will be, we're going to do sort of an overview of the topic, kind of what is NAFTA, some stuff you may already know, but it may be helpful to you. Some concepts to understand, some basic ideas that will be helpful to you. And then we'll kind of move into the stuff that you might talk about a little bit more in the round. So talking about, for example, definitions and frameworks and how, we may sort of weigh this. Then we'll let these guys do contention level stuff and sort of talk about that. And then finally, some strategic tips, both for the resolution specifically and also for NSDA Nationals. It's a very different kind of tournament if you haven't been before. There's a lot to learn. There's a sort of different way of approaching it. And by the way, we're gonna cite some sources as we talk. Mm-hmm. We're gonna list some basic sources to go to. Those will all be listed in the notes below the video. So don't worry if you didn't catch them. You don't have to rewind or go and Google them. They'll be down there for you. So,
and for the sake of time, we will be bouncing around a lot. So in the description as well will be some timestamps into the different topics we cover. That'll be a rough roadmap if you just want to skip to the juicy bits, whatever you're interested in. Yeah, with that.
Yeah. So
I think we can move on to the resolution and analysis. Brett, you want to take over on that?
Yeah, sure. So the overview. NAFTA is, of course, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And as you may know, this is a free trade agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico that took effect in 1994. The biggest and most important sort of aspect of it removes all the tariffs and all the duties on imports and exports between the three member countries, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. But it does a lot of other things too. I mean, it doesn't just do that. So, for example, one of the things that made it unique was it was one of the first regional free trade agreements that addressed services and not just goods. It addressed intellectual property. It required all the members to respect, for example, the copyrighted works that came from the various countries.
And I mean, that's really important because 40% of America's exports today are service products. They're not even manufactured physical products. It's services that you're talking about like that.
Right, exactly. So, up until that point, a lot of folks viewed free trade as more about moving goods. And it is. And a lot of these debates probably will focus on that. But the idea of protecting intellectual property is an important one. It has dispute resolution procedures. For example, if one country thinks that another country is dumping goods below cost, there's dispute resolution procedures. And I think this is important, it also was one of the first major free trade agreements that included environmental protection provisions. And this will be important later when we talk about sort of the cons offense about environmental problems, but also how the pro answers those. But there is sort of a nuance to that, which is that the environmental protections came in the form of a separate side treaty, which who knows, is that included within NAFTA? It's something that's debatable. So I will say, as the only person here who was alive when this happened in 1994, I won't tell you how long I'd been alive, but it was incredibly controversial. Ross Perot, the third-party candidate for president, described it as a giant sucking sound. Yes, thank you,
Just
Luke.
in case you weren't clear on
Just
that.
in case you didn't know what a giant sucking sound sounds like, that's what it was. But the idea is going to vacuum jobs out of the United States and into Mexico, where because lower cost of labor, fewer worker protections, and it was very controversial.
And I mean, for the most part, he was right. We're looking at it today. How do you pronounce it? The maquiladora programs.
Yeah.
Basically, in Mexico, jobs are it's so much cheaper to have and produce factories in Mexico that companies are now making these cheap factories in Mexico. It's providing almost 35% of Mexico's employment, almost 60% of their exports come from these programs that are just American companies building factories in Mexico far cheaper, and it's taking jobs away from places like Michigan and New York that we're seeing today. Really big issue.
And once we get into the con argument, which we'll do later, I do have sources from Cornell and Harvard, several different studies that show not only Mexican and American workers losing their jobs and their economies being displaced, but lots of different workers' issues with these programs. And again, I'm not certain of the pronunciation. You can figure that out on your own. We're not vocal coaches, but border factories, essentially, that are taking advantage of different workers' rights in Mexico as compared to the U.S.
So, yeah, and this kind of gets to one of the sort of the core areas that I sort of wanted to talk about, which is, as you go into this resolution and as you start preparing for it, aside from just sort of the specific contention level stuff, the specific points you're going to write, the specific blocks that you're going to write to try to get ready for NSDA Nationals, there's some sort of core concepts that I think folks need to understand. And one of those really is how the sort of economic concept of free trade works. And I think it's really important as people get ready for NSDA on this, and really for any topic, doing this kind of thing with whatever the underlying issues are is important. To understand sort of the economics of free trade, right? And so, the basic idea, you get all these sort of folks from like the Chicago School and all these sort of free market folks, and they tell you that, look, here's how free trade works, if you ask them. Free trade is just the idea of removing barriers to things that people want to do anyway. Right. In other words, so free trade is not like some controversial new program or policy. It's just you have people in Mexico, for example, who want to sell a product, and you have people in the United States or Canada who, for example, want to buy a product or vice versa, whatever. They want to do these deals, right? They believe that they're better off if you do them, right? All free trade is, according to sort of free market economists, is the idea of removing those barriers. And this is sort of a concept called economic efficiency, which has kind of a specialized meaning, but the basic idea is, if one person can make something better or more cheaply than another, then it makes sense for them to make it and to sell it to the other party. So proponents of free trade will say, all this is, how could it be bad, right, to allow two groups of people to do a deal where both sides at the end of the day feel like they're better off? And that's what happens in free market capitalism, right? And so the counter to that is that there are all sorts of sort of what you would call economically like negative externalities. In other words, it's not just the people who are making these deals that are affected, right? It's workers, right? It's people who have to live in the environment. And it's even potentially people in countries outside the three signatories who can be affected by these things.
Yeah, things like that are going to be especially important for the con to focus on, because if you try to make it an economic argument from the con's perspective, it's probably not going to go super well for you.
Yeah, it won't.
Yeah, it definitely won't go super well for you. The idea for the con is especially going to be making it that, yes, there might be some economic benefit that the pro is going to get, but at the end of the day, our story has to be about workers' rights and environmental protections. And again, I'll get to that later.
Yeah, I think that like there's we certainly want to encourage people to like view as much of the resolution as debatable as possible. We don't want to say like this is off limits and this is not debatable, but I think you will find as you research the literature that there is a very strong consensus that NAFTA has to some extent contributed to the growth of all three economies. All three economies are bigger. Trade is much bigger. There are in fact more jobs. And so that kind of gets to the nub of the economic argument, which is like, if the United States loses certain jobs to Mexico, for example, in manufacturing,
or vice versa,
sure, but the amount of trade that's going on, the volume of trade, just makes all of the economies bigger. Like the rising tide lifts all boats. Does the effect of having just a bigger economy overall actually make for more jobs? And there are economists who are going to say, yeah, we've lost some manufacturing jobs, right? But because all of the economies are growing faster, then you're going to actually end up with net more jobs in the United States, right? And so that's sort of a kind of a concept that works there. So those are sort of some key ideas, sort of an overview of kind of the basic concepts that I think are probably important to talk about, as you get into working on your cases. When we begin to talk about kind of the next area, which is you start digging in and you start like actually trying to write the case. You start with sort of the definitions and framework, right? In other words, how are you going to frame the resolution? And I think that, if you were, I know we're not talking to novice debaters. If you are a novice and you're going to NSDA, first of all, great job, but you're not a novice anymore. You're not new, obviously. So, a novice debater might walk into this topic and might just say, well, this is a debate about whether NAFTA is good or bad. And that's just, if I show that NAFTA is good, I win if I'm the pro. And that's really just not accurate. You have to think about sort of what the scope of the resolution is, like what the scope of the topic is. And, so for example, I think it's important when you say like U.S. participation in, right, as a phrase. What are you talking about? Like another way of putting this would be like, what happens, say, for example, if you're the pro or if you're the con? Let's say if you're the con, what happens if the judge votes for you? Like, is it a debate about like whether the United States should have ever been in this from the very beginning, or is it a debate about whether, here in 2018 with the debates that are going on in the news, whether the United States should withdraw today?
So what's going to be important, especially in this round, is deciding how you're going to scope the argument, and especially temporally. Are we going to talk about NAFTA from a perspective of the entirety of its existence and whether or not the pros outweigh the cons, or specifically now? That argument is going to change which sources you use, which philosophical points you're going to take, whether it's free trade is bad in general, or are you going to look at it more of, let's look at NAFTA right now and trade currents right now and how it's affecting us. That's super important, and you need to, A, decide which one you're going to push for, but also at the same time be ready in case your opponent ends up using and getting with another argument instead.
Yeah, so this really goes to sort of the definition of like what U.S. participation in means, right? That sort of definitional phrase. And, the resolution isn't super clear. So, like Luke is saying, when we say U.S. participation in, we could be talking about U.S. participation like from 1994 to today. And like, let's say, for example, you're a con, right? You're a con team. If you do that, that's fine. You can bring in all the costs and all the negatives of the last 24 years, right? But you're going to have to account for sort of the net economic benefits of the last 24 years. But that's one way to do it, right? Mm-hmm. U.S. participation in can mean the entirety of our participation, which spans now like a quarter of a century. But alternatively, there's another way to look at it, which is, the idea that here in 2018, the United States faces a choice, and this is all over the news with what President Trump is saying, things like that. Do we stay in or do we leave? Right? And if, for example, a con were to try to scope it that way...
Mm-hmm. Which might be more useful for the con, in all honesty.
It might be more useful. It also might be supportable, because when you look, for example, at the resolution, you look at the word outweigh. Mm-hmm. That's in the present tense.
Definitely.
If the word were has outweighed or did outweigh or something else, I think you'd have a strong argument that you need to take into account the totality. But if, a smart con might argue that outweigh in the present tense means we should really be focusing on the present tense.
Yeah, and the general focus in PF tends to be on current events in the first place. So generally speaking, especially if you're the con, this is going to be a favorable way to scope the round. And the final reason is because you can ignore all of the benefits that your opponent might have ready from the last 24 years and say, listen, at the end of the day, we don't care about how effective NAFTA has been in the last 24 years. We've gotten our benefits. It's time to get out before the ice caps melt, et cetera, et cetera.
Right, and one of the most important things coming off of that is, if you're going to look at things in terms of, okay, going off of right now, you have to build kind of the scenario for your judge about what's going to happen if you vote either in the pro or for the con. Obviously, we can't build specific plans or specific arguments about what's going to happen. We have to make our best guesses. So an important part of framing your debate is going to be, okay, look, how are we going to quantify future impacts? How can we make sure and give the judge, to the best of our ability, a certainty of what the impact of something that might happen is going to be? That's one of the things with the pros that we can see, all right, look, we've got these benefits right now. We can definitely see what's going to happen if we leave, and the con's going to have to make up a lot of ground, and that's where I think the pro is ahead if you weigh it in terms of the present tense of outweigh, is because the pro can see immediate impacts, but the con is going to have to convince the judge and build this world of what's going to happen, maybe, hopefully, in the future for their side to win, for their side to have a greater impact.
Yeah, I think those are both good points, and they sort of dovetail together, which is like, you can definitely see a con saying, exactly what you said, Luke, which is like, we've gotten all these benefits, but that's not the question we're being asked, right? The question we're being asked is whether our participation now matters. And this actually allows the con to make a lot of hay from some of these arguments that our NAFTA is outdated. So, for example, there's a pretty good article in The Nation. I don't recall the date, but it's from last year, I think. And the argument is basically that, look, whatever you think about whatever you think about like NAFTA historically, we could do a lot better now, right? Mm-hmm. We could come up with a trade deal that is better on worker rights, that's better on the environment, that's better on all these things. So I can definitely see a con team sort of trying to say it's not a choice between a world where NAFTA did happen and didn't happen in 1994. It's a choice between a world where we just sort of sit with the status quo here in 2018 and keep this very flawed trade agreement, or alternatively, where we pull out and get a new trade agreement. Now, of course, there with that comes the argument you would have to show that we would in fact get a new and better trade agreement. I don't think that there's a really strong argument that the judge can fiat that. I mean, I think that at most, to the extent there is any fiat on this resolution, it's we're in or we're out.
Now, one thing you could say is that one of the cons of the current deal is that there is a better deal possible, if you want to try to scope it more to the resolution itself.
Yes. I guess what I'm saying is, yes, that's exactly right.
If you try to do that.
The only counter argument to that on the pro side is, whatever advantages of your better deal you have, you're going to have to sort of discount those by the probability that we get the better deal. Like, we don't automatically get to sort of say, Judge, when you sign your ballot, a better deal comes into place. Number one, because that's not what the resolution says, and number two, because that sounds a lot like a plan, which you can't do in PF.
And the chances of that happening for you guys at Nationals honestly just depends. Most likely later on, they're not going to try to do that. They're most likely just going to be straight up about it, say, look, here's the chances of this happening. This is what you need to think because of this. But there are going to be people who are going to say, look, okay, we can assume that President Trump ends NAFTA today and we see all these imports and increases in tariffs on other countries, yada, yada, yada. But the fact is, they've got to prove that to you and they've got to prove that to your judge. Because if they can't, one, you don't have anything to argue with on the pro, and two, the judge doesn't have anything to vote on as a judge because they haven't proven anything. They're just saying, okay, believe me.
Yeah. So also on the scope, I guess the other thing, and this is not so much a strategic concern as it is just a knowledge concern, you really need, I think, to be very knowledgeable about sort of like both sides, whether you're the pro or the con. Like, what would the world actually look like if we woke up tomorrow and assuming President Trump has the ability to unilaterally pull us out of NAFTA, he does, or maybe Congress does, whatever, however it happens. And there's a debate about, what would have to happen, but let's assume that it happens. What would it look like? And I think it's very important that, all teams sort of become very knowledgeable about like what the background status quo is or would be if NAFTA went away. And this can actually get a little tricky. There's a real world debate about it. The first thing is, and this is, I think, really important, is under no circumstances will we go back to the status quo of 1994 because we have a thing called the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which came into being in 1995 after NAFTA came into being. And the WTO is this sort of background organization of 130-something states, and it is not a true free trade agreement in the sense that like NAFTA is or that the TPP would be. For those of you who are hoping that we would get the TPP topic, I know that the majority of students, actually, if you look at the voting, were. But either one, it's not as strong as those, but it is sort of a background agreement that says you have to extend what's called most favored nation status, which means you, aside from some exceptions for things like NAFTA, you have to apply the same baseline tariffs to all these countries around the world. So if we were to remove NAFTA entirely, and there's actually a really good Forbes article about this and a New York Times article, and I'll drop those in the notes below, that explain like what the tariffs would look like if NAFTA went away, and they're just not all that high. I mean, the baseline overall tariffs, for most industries are in the single digits. Now, it gets even more complicated, right? Because under WTO, you can have different tariffs for different things. Like under NAFTA, the tariff for all goods moving between these countries is 0. Right, it's very simple. Mm-hmm. But if we were to revert to WTO, you could have, for example, a 1% tariff on a car part, but like a 22% tariff on a full automobile. And I don't, off the top of my head, have like an immediate like strategic impact of that for one side or another. But I do know this: I know that a team that is able to articulate it really well, like here's what WTO does, and tell a story about how, one good could move over here with this tariff, but then it would come back with more. Teams like that are going to be in a better position.
I mean, the other thing is you could go purely off the baseline of, look, if we go back to most favored nation status, then countries are going to have an increased or decreased level of soft power with each other. So if the United States, Mexico, and Canada had to revert back to most favored trade status, basically what we're going to, or most, what was it?
Most favored nation.
Yeah, most favored nation status. We could see, all right, the United States is trying to imply certain tariffs on certain products that they know that places like Mexico or Canada are going to need more and more and more of, increasing their political leverage against these countries and trying to have start basically a cold trade war where nothing really happens, but we see increased leveraging against other countries.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, what Brett was trying to point out a minute ago is, and this is more of a general point. Okay, what Brett did point out, what I am going to articulate on before I lose my position on our college team, what I wanted to articulate on is that at the end of the day, trade is complicated, and this is not a resolution that's going to be straight up and down, good and evil, Gandalf versus Mordor.
Yeah.
You're going to have to be good at telling a story about trade that a judge that doesn't know a lot about trade is going to understand.
That is so true, and when we get to the contention level stuff, when we talk about impacts, I want to talk about that because there are so many different ways that arguments can get turned on this. They can get turned very quickly depending on who you're talking about. We'll get to that in a second. I want to add one more thing about who's affected. Remember, there's also this what was called the CUS FTA or CUS FTA, which is I guess maybe a lot of people called it. Probably not. Probably nobody called it CUS FTA, but whatever. The Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, which was actually in place as the predecessor to NAFTA and also had zero tariffs. It was very similar to NAFTA. It just didn't involve Mexico. And it actually only went out of existence when it was specifically preempted by NAFTA. So there are a lot of experts who actually believe that between the United States and Canada, right, if we were to get rid of NAFTA, that we would immediately revert back to CUSFTA. And there's a debate about whether there's a legal debate about whether that's the case. There's an article in the Globe and Mail, which is a well-known Canadian newspaper, that sort of lays out the arguments on this. Again, we'll put that in the notes. But, there is maybe even an argument that all of your net impacts about U.S.-Canada trade might get very close to zero if you can sell the judge on the idea that we pull out of NAFTA and it's just, at least as far as the United States and Canada are concerned, immediately supplanted by CUSFTA. So
a lot of what I've got on the pro specifically focuses on the United States and Mexico,
right?
Because a lot of it relies on the assumption that the United States and Canada would go back to this bilateral trade agreement that they had way back in the
I mean, even if it doesn't automatically revert, as a matter of law, there's a very good chance that something very much like it, because you don't hear a whole lot of political complaining about, the trade deficit or whatever with Canada. Right. I mean, it's, I don't mean to, if we have any Canadian friends out there, we don't mean to imply that we're exactly the same. We know that you guys have bare naked ladies and what is it, Tom Hortons or whatever, but we're pretty close, or whatever it's called. Okay, so to get the sort of substantive pro-con of this started, we are going to invoke the use of the Mississippi State debate team talking ball.
Josh and I can't be trusted to keep it civil otherwise.
Right, that's how it works in college debates. So if you have the talking ball, you have precedence on the floor now, of course, your opponent can interrupt to ask questions and interject. I expect there to be back and forth, but the person with the ball is going to have precedence. So Josh, since you're pro, you're going to go first. I'm going to give you the ball. So congratulations.
Yeah. All right. So one of the baselines we're going to start off with is just kind of some backstory, some numbers on NAFTA. Of the 20, the trade agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico was worth almost $20.1 trillion. And of that $20.1 trillion, the United States, in terms of GDP, makes up $18.5 trillion of it. So a large part of the economic impact coming from NAFTA is coming out of the United States. So while we're not specifically focusing on the United States as an actor, it's important to see what United States manufacturers and United States companies are going to have, what impact they're going to have on this agreement on the world. One of the biggest things, and this comes to us from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, October 2017, again linked down in the description down below, is that trade with Canada and Mexico supports 14 million jobs, and it's estimated from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that 5 million of those jobs are directly supported by the increase in trade generated by NAFTA. So what I as the pro am going to argue is that if we get rid of NAFTA, what we're going to see is a decrease in production that's going to lead to increased prices. We're going to see an increase in tariffs. We're going to see a whole lot of bad stuff happen with the economy. First of all, leaving NAFTA would severely harm U.S. manufacturing.
Can I just go time out? One thing that he said, I think is really important on the pro side, is he's talking about overall net number of jobs for everybody, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's important for the pro, right? Because the argument that the pro wants to be making on this is sort of that free trade is not a zero-sum game, right? Mm-hmm. In other words, we're not just moving around trade that would have been going somewhere else. We are literally removing the barriers to, economic growth that would not have happened. What we would call economically dead weight loss. We put a barrier in and it keeps a good deal from happening. So if you want to talk about jobs, I think to sort of preempt some of those arguments, those so what arguments about where these jobs go, talking about, okay, here's what happens. NAFTA unleashes the economy, it grows faster, that growth produces jobs that wouldn't have existed. These are net additional jobs that would not have happened in the world anywhere but for NAFTA. That does a real good job of answering the so what. We're talking about overall jobs, not like jobs in a particular country. And it even globally, right? These are not jobs that we took away. For example, we traded more between the US and Mexico and therefore took it away from like Brazil. These are just jobs that are net additions to the world. So I think that's important that we're growing the pie as the pro. That's our narrative, right? As opposed to just splitting it different ways. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And so the way I would start out on the pro is by establishing what Brett was talking about in the very beginning of the video, right? What's going to happen if we remove NAFTA? What is the world going to look like if you vote for the con? Well, in 2017, Canada and Mexico, because of NAFTA, were the top two U.S. export markets, with Canada accounting for $282 billion and Mexico accounting for $243 billion. So, if the United States got rid of NAFTA, say if the United States just pulled out of NAFTA, what would most likely happen is, like we discussed earlier in the video, the United States and Canada would likely resume their status as bilateral trade partners, still pretty much the same effect as NAFTA, but the United States and Mexico would see drastic changes in how our economies were handled, how international imports and exports would turn into. Basically, what we're going to see is that immediately pulling out of NAFTA, we're going to have a couple of impacts. This comes to us from CNN Money, July 6, 2016. What would most likely happen is the United States would increase imports and tariffs on Mexico, and Mexico would likely do the same to the United States. They would increase tariffs on us. What this would do is either drive down imports and increase costs on the imports that we do still have coming into the country. Now, one of the biggest markets inside the United States is agriculture. Agriculture accounts for $17.9 billion, and Mexico is the top importer of U.S. beef, rice, soybean meal, corn sweeteners, apples, and beans, and number two
You can tell he's a former PF debater. He's just like blazing through this. This is how you do it, as you know.
Corn, soybean, and oils. All of these things that are huge benefits towards the U.S. market that if we got rid of NAFTA, tariffs and imports, prices would go up dramatically. So what we're going to see is increased prices for the consumer. We're going to see decreased jobs for Mexican workers. We're going to see decreased trade for United States companies. All over, we're going to see economic impacts on the negative side if we got rid of NAFTA.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is downplay that.
Well, now hold on, just one second. Before you go, I want to add one more thing to your burden. Okay.
Oh, great.
One other thing is, and I think this is important. Remember how earlier we were talking about like what is the time frame? Like what happens in terms of, are we talking about like going back in time and like not having a NAFTA, that being a good thing, or are we talking about like changing it today? And if the pro does scope it to, does the United States leave in 2018, which I think is probably the easiest way, a very defensible way to do it. One other thing, in addition to all this net trade stuff Josh is talking about, is at this point, there's a lot of evidence out there about how the supply chains for U.S.-based companies are now sort of interweaving north and south of the border with Mexico, also with Canada, right? So, for example, if you build a car at the car plant that we have here in near Tupelo, Mississippi, or down in Canton, Mississippi, where in our state, that car was not built from scratch, in the state of Mississippi or even in the United States. It has lots of parts that are coming from across the border and many from Mexico, right? And so, one of the arguments is that if you were to try to undo that now, you would just sort of be ripping us out of an established supply chain. And there's a couple of impacts from that, not to add to your burden, but a couple of impacts from that. One impact is it's just going to be really, really hard on U.S. manufacturers if you sort of rip their supply chain in half, or at least impose tariffs to make it hard to do. You're going to make them less competitive overall. But the second thing is that, if you say that we're going to have tariffs to move stuff back and forth over the border, it's not necessarily going to be the case that these manufacturers are going to say, oh, well, we tried, right? We tried to sort of outsource some of this work to a country with lower wages. I guess we just need to give up and move all these jobs back to Detroit at $50 an hour. What they're going to do is, if we get rid of NAFTA, we're still going to have CAFTA, Central American Free Trade Agreement. We're still going to have, other free trade agreements in other countries, and we're actually going to have countries that we don't have particularly strong free trade agreements that are even despite the tariffs are cheaper, like China, the Philippines, places like that. So it very well may be. There's actually a strong argument. There's literature out there on this. I don't have it in front of me. That taking this sort of interwoven supply chain, where at least maybe 50% of the work stays in the United States, and getting rid of NAFTA will actually end up in not bringing back the say 50% that had gone overseas, but sending the remaining 50% somewhere else. So instead of moving the Mexican work back to the United States, we'll just say, well, I guess if we're not going to be able to do this local geographic cross-border thing that's so easy because of Mexico being right next door, we might as well just move the whole operation to a cheaper country, because it's the next cheapest thing to do. And so anyway, sorry to load you up with that. If you've got it,
exactly.
Enough,
so
right?
now I'm ready to, and this is not to be pessimistic, but at the end of the day, the pro is going to have the economic numbers on this. So the most important thing for the con.
It's absurd.
Right. Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, for the con, what we're going to have to do is downplay that and make this a moralistic argument. But to start with, at the very least, I think at least it's even more important for the con in this case to know your so whats and to know your scoping, because you're going to be able to get a lot of those statistics if they're not correctly balanced in the round. So if they're just throwing out money signs, and you can make an argument that, okay, well, where's that money going? Who's it going to? Who is it benefiting, etc. You can downplay a lot of whatever the pro is going to say about money if you can so what it via the scoping or via who it's benefiting at the end of the day. And another thing, too, is when we're talking about ripping out of supply chains and that kind of thing, this is from the perspective of scoping it to a world where we leave NAFTA right now. What are the effects? And if the pro is going to go the route of, well, if we leave NAFTA right now, we're going to have all these supply chains ripped out of the ground, you at the same time, or the con at the same time, has the right to say, okay, well, we can get into a better free trade agreement that can reutilize all of these factories. At the end of the day, if the pro is going to be able to make a plan like that, you have to fight back with something similar.
Yes, I agree with that completely. I do think that there's a lot of sort of meta strategy in terms of how you want to position yourself on this one that I think is important. So yes, exactly. Like if the con, I think that the con, if you were to say let's leave and because we leave, let's be in a position to negotiate a better NAFTA. There are downsides to that, of course. The downside is you're going to have to prove that it will happen.
Right.
But there's evidence that it's likely to happen. There are statements, from various leaders. I do think it is worth at least considering strategically having something where you say we're going to leave NAFTA for the express purpose of putting ourselves in a position where we can negotiate a better one. And there's a lot of common sense there. Like the United States is such a huge market, it would be borderline suicidal for Mexico not to negotiate this. Mm-hmm. And so if you win that, if you're able to produce the literature that shows that it's likely that we will get a better deal, then that is one good way to sort of basically take out a lot of those economic impacts. You're saying, oh, we'll have those impacts. We'll have even bigger economic impacts. Like if you'd be like Trump and be like, we'll have the best economic impacts. Yeah. We'll have like amazing economic impacts. Plus, we'll also have environmental protections and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
So it is worth examining the risk-benefit analysis of taking that sort of run further in the direction they're running kind of argument.
Yeah. At the very least, it's an ace up your sleeve if the pro in this case decides to beat you down on the idea that leaving NAFTA means that everything blows up because the system is already in place. You've got to consider that if they're going to play the temporal game, you might have to as well. Moving on from that, though, like I said, because trade is a complicated thing too, if your opponent spouts out a bunch of complicated trade facts and numbers and things that don't make a lot of sense to a judge, and you say, okay, Arms of an Angel starts playing in the background, the poor Mexican workers, like, getting into that is going to help you a lot. I'm trying to, obviously, I'm serious. That is going to be what you need to do, and I'm going to go ahead and get into some sources and some points, because we've really got two big things on the con here. We've got environmental impacts, and we've got impacts to workers' rights and workers' protections.
I agree with that.
Okay, so with all of that, the first main thing that we're going to do is talk about our two main contentions for the con, which are going to be our environmental impacts and our workers' rights impacts. So with that, let's go ahead and start with environmental. The first thing that I want to talk about is that, and these are more your small ball kind of things, but they are a little bit stronger and easier to win, in my opinion. The idea that bigger companies in America, which is objectively the strongest economy in NAFTA of those three countries. Of course, don't want to forget. The biggest economy and the big companies in America are going to bypass America's stronger environmental regulations by moving their companies to Mexico and dumping more in their rivers, getting rid of the stuff in Mexico City, etc. Essentially, the EPA isn't going to be able to have an effect on what these companies are doing if they're doing them in Mexico. So that's our small ball environmental argument. And moving on from that, our bigger environmental argument is the idea that increasing trade in general and increasing economic output in general is going to lead to CO2 emission and is inevitably going to lead to climate change, which is a major problem America is having right now. In PF, if you want to have that big tie-in to one of the big four problems in the world today, climate change is the one you're going to want to be hitting on, because more trade, more environmental output, and more companies that are able to abuse environmental regulations by leaving the U.S. are going to mean that we're going to have more CO2 output and a greater increase in climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, obviously, it carries risks with it, like, because anytime, I mean, the basic gist of the argument is, yes, as you say, small ball. There are examples of dumping and examples of deforestation and those sorts of things that happen, in Mexico, and those are pretty, I think, pretty winnable and pretty supportable. Your argument, though, when a little bit bigger, is that economic growth and putting up more smokestacks and putting up more factories in countries that didn't have them before leads to more, CFC emissions and things like that, which links to the big impact of climate change.
But okay, whenever you're talking about economic growth leading to increased like environmental emissions and stuff like that, is the answer there in the con world just to stop all economic growth? Because if the ultimate priority here is having reduced environmental impacts, then the best way to do that would just to be, get rid of all economic growth, get rid of everything, have everybody live in huts. And ultimately what that's going to amount to is, okay, obviously that's not going to happen. All they're doing whenever they bring up this argument is acknowledging that the status quo exists. They're not saying how the con side is any better. Because what's likely going to happen, and what I would argue is the pro, is that, okay, say we get rid of NAFTA, say we move companies out of Mexico, we're just going to have the same exact environmental harms coming from a different country. So there's not really an answer whenever the con provides this. They're just saying that, oh, this is a problem that exists with NAFTA, and we can acknowledge, yes, that's a problem, but it's not like it's going to get any better just because we get rid of NAFTA.
Yeah, so look, here's what I would ask. So, and this goes back again, and I think this is super important on this topic, which is, what does the world look like if NAFTA either A, doesn't happen back in 1984, or B, we get rid of it today in 2018? So, yeah, I mean, I'll grant you that we have, dumping and deforestation and things like that going on in Mexico, and I'll grant you that you're going to see, greater economic growth equals more sort of greenhouse emissions. Fine, and you can access all the terrible impacts of climate change from there. But the response would be, we're also in 20 other free trade agreements. We're in the Central American Free Trade Agreement. So if we get rid of this particular one, right, I mean, why do we think that all of a sudden they're going to come back and start following like U.S. environmental regulations as opposed to going to any of the other places that we have free trade agreements, or for that matter, going to countries that maybe we don't have quite as strong an agreement with, but the costs are so much lower, like the Philippines or something like that. Mm-hmm. So what's the argument there? I mean, how do we win that? Yeah. And this applies to both sides, by the way. Right. It's not just yours.
And what I'm saying with the con, and again, this is why it's so important that you know your scoping and you know where you are with who's benefiting what. If you have to tie it back to this is an inherent flaw in NAFTA, and we're talking about whether the inherent pros outweigh the inherent flaws in NAFTA, you can go that route. You can also say that you can focus on the fact that that applies for just large scale economic growth, but at the end of the day, not having free trade through Mexico is going to affect somewhat, because Mexico's the closest place where American companies can outsource their work and have lower economic impact. So at the very least, it's a motivator, if not a way to stop the problem entirely.
There is a don't make the perfect the enemy of the good argument. There is an argument that, like, well, if we can't debate whether or not this one agreement that leads to environmental degradation is bad, unless we debate all of them, then we can never get this debate started, right? In other words, we can never move in the direction of better environmental protections if all you can say is, well, if you only do one and you don't deal with the other, say 15 agreements, right, where we could send these manufacturing, these factories and things, and they could go and manufacture with lower regulations, then we'll never get the debate started. So we need to start with this one, and then if you want to move on down the road and say, should we, amend or withdraw from another one, we can have that debate at another time.
Yeah, essentially what you want to do is, if the pro gets a little bit too esoteric and a little bit too flaunty, you want to make your story simple, make them look like Moneybags McGreedy Pants, and sell your story to your judge. Moving on from that, we're going on to a very similar point, which is the workers' rights and workers' regulations that have to do with this topic, and it follows the same logic. So again, if you can convince your judge of one, you can convince them of the other. The idea that big American companies, because of the free trade agreement, are moving to Mexico because they don't have to pay their workers as much, they don't have to compensate them as much, they can get away with more violations, that kind of thing. And specifically, I'm looking at sources from CBS News to start with, what will be in the description, that says that 2 million Mexican farmers have been put out of business due to the American and Canadian corn being cheaper. I know that Josh has already brought up several sources on the Pro about things being outsourced to Mexico, and what a big percentage of Mexican workers, or the Mexican economy, relies on American
I've got
imports.
more once you're done talking.
Yeah,
so.
definitely. He certainly does. But if you can use those against him and say that, yes, that's a bad thing that they're relying on this because American companies are taking advantage of them, go for it. But moving on from that, we've got a source from Cornell, which will also be down there, which is talking more about union deals specifically. So it's the idea that American companies are bypassing unions by using either the threat of moving to Mexico, like as a bargaining chip, or straight up moving to Mexico when the unions aren't there.
See, I think that's important because I think that lets you access a couple of more impacts. Like, so on the one hand, you can say you've got these maquiladoras, which I hope I got right. Maquiladoras. Okay. Mm-hmm. Number one, you can move the jobs to Mexico, in which case you're going to have lower, minimum wages.
Yeah.
You're going to have typically less worker protections. You're going to have weaker unions. That's the reason the jobs move there, right? Mm-hmm. Because, frankly, the labor is cheaper, right? Or, just as importantly, you can use the threat of moving the job to Mexico as a cudgel, as sort of a leverage tool to basically say, oh, you don't like these proposed wage cuts, factory workers in Indiana or wherever. Mm-hmm. Well, that's fine. We'll just have to start, looking at our options, which would include this lovely location south of Monterrey, Mexico or whatever, mm-hmm. and to impact the overall quality of labor protections in the United States. You'd have to find evidence of that. I mean, it's a logical argument. You need sources on it, but they exist.
Right. And the Cornell study that I'm citing has a lot on that, specifically with cudgeling unions.
And there's a really good answer for the Pro that actually, I in my opinion, outweighs that. Because if you're talking about, okay, we got plant workers in Indiana. Sorry, can I have the talking ball?
Just go.
Goodness gracious, Josh.
So, sorry, I'm trying to be polite. If we see these plant workers in Indiana saying the same exact thing, right? They have unions saying, all right, look, we're going to decrease your wages, otherwise we're moving to some plant in Mexico. The fact is, that is that is less of a harm than what we would see on the other end, right? If we see the same exact thing happening in Mexico, if we get rid of NAFTA and we see these companies uprooting themselves from Mexico, the fact is these maquiladora factories employ 30% of Mexico's workforce and account for almost 65% of Mexico's GDP and exports. So the fact is, sure, maybe if we can bludgeon Indiana factory workers with union regulations or something like that, and these companies can skirt union regulations, the fact is that's less of a harm because this isn't a zero-sum game, this isn't a zero-sum debate. That's less of a harm than what would happen if they did the same exact thing to workers in Mexico who are relying on this.
In other words, like, if you're going to do the sort of typical, con thing of saying, well, look at these poor workers in Indiana and Pennsylvania and other places. They lost their jobs, their towns were destroyed or whatever, how bad for them. And then you're going to turn around and say, well, what would you do? Well, I would rip the jobs out of Mexico. I'd bring them right back. And I would hurt these workers who are even more impoverished than the workers who were hurt in the United States. Everything in this debate has a flip side. So it's important to be aware of that.
And if you can make the connection between, these are workers that used to be on the corn farms that are getting pulled off of them, that's great. And if you can even somehow predict, and if you can find sources for it, great. But I don't know if there's a good chance of that. Say something along the lines of pulling out of NAFTA means that American companies have to start playing by the rules and that Mexican workers go back to whatever they were doing before NAFTA. That's great. And then the final point I want to make is that at the end of the day, and this is kind of an impact statement you can use, is that do these cons that I'm mentioning, the workers' rights and that kind of thing, outweigh the pros and the economic benefits of NAFTA? And my answer to that would be yes. Why? Well, why do we vote in these regulations in the U.S. in the first place? Yeah. And all we're going to do is bypass them by moving out to Mexico or somewhere else. If you can get your pro, even in CrossX or in Crossfire, if you can get them to agree that the regulations in America are good, then they don't really have a great argument as to why it's okay to move them out to Mexico or somewhere else. Yeah. Or maybe they do.
Because we save money.
Okay. So, gentlemen, nice job. Thank you.
Concede the talking ball.
All right. So, those are some sort of general thoughts and sort of areas for contentions and thoughts on both the pro and the con. What we want to do to wrap up is to talk about, I guess, some sort of strategic points and strategic thoughts about sort of structuring arguments, and then finally some strategic thoughts on NSDA Nationals specifically. specifically. Some of these we've already kind of touched on, but I kind of want to make sure that we are emphasizing all of them. So the first one is sort of really thinking about like where your impacts land, like who they affect. In other words, are we talking, for example, on the one hand, on like a global net impact, like the economy of the world is getting bigger and it's getting better for everybody? Or are we talking about like splitting up the pie? In other words, some jobs move from the United States to Mexico. And in the latter case, it's very easy to respond with what we talked about earlier, which is just like, so what? Right? In other words, okay, we move jobs from the United States to Mexico, and the pro says that's bad. The con says not only is that not necessarily bad, that's arguably good, because like if you think about the marginal utility of money, right, having these jobs had to go to somebody. There weren't an unlimited number of jobs. Having them go to folks who have lower incomes to begin with or a more impoverished country is actually good on the whole. Yep. So thinking about like what is the net impact of this as opposed to just moving things around. The pro is going to really want to tell a story about how we're just unleashing trade and creating brand new things. The con is going to want to tell a story about how no, we're just moving jobs around, but we do have these negative externalities like the environment and labor standards that we're going to drive downward. And those are the sort of two narratives. But also remember, and this is sort of the second level like meta thing, which is that you have to be prepared for the question of what does the world look like when NAFTA goes away, right? And the idea that it's just this, okay, there was economic injustice under NAFTA, therefore when we get rid of NAFTA, that won't exist. There's environmental harms under NAFTA, therefore when we get rid of NAFTA, that won't exist. That's just not true. Or there are many, many places around the world where these jobs can be moved, right? And there are actually strong arguments that if you get rid of NAFTA, these jobs could go to places that have even lower, controls on environmental issues, that will have even lower standards of living, low standards for workers and things like that, and those sorts of things. So you really have to be prepared to answer those questions on both sides. And I think if you're not, you can just get preempted really quickly.
And what I would say real quick is that if it boils down to a question of what happens when NAFTA is gone, if you're the pro, you're going to make the argument that what happens is that all the cons, whole environmental case, that just happens somewhere else. If you're the con, you're going to try to give a prediction that these environmental problems are going to go away because we'll negotiate a better deal, or because for whatever reason American jobs are going to stay where they need to be, et cetera, et cetera. So make sure you come up with convince the judge that your outcome is going to stick.
I think the pro really needs to sort of invest in a very strong line of arguments, and it's very well sourced, that says that, look, a world in which like NAFTA didn't happen and therefore the United States just stuck with the status quo and like jobs didn't go overseas and globalization didn't happen is an imaginary fantasy world. Like it just doesn't happen that way, right?
I mean, you guys are going to have no shortage of resources to pull on this because it's been in the news lately. It's now the new Nationals topic. Like there's going to be droves of information that you're going to be able to find. So be sure to do a ton of research on this.
Yeah, so second sort of major analytical point that I think is worth noting is be aware of how important confounding factors are with your evidence in this case. Let me explain what I mean. If you just looked at the raw data of NAFTA and you just sort of compared the GDP of these three countries in 1994 to today, you'd say, oh, it's much bigger, right? It's huge. Trade is vastly larger. There's billions and billions of dollars more trade each year. There's even more jobs than there used to be, in absolute terms at least, right? And so if you were to just look at that, then boy, this would be a really impressive picture. But obviously that's a bad way to do it because so many things have happened since 1994 that aren't NAFTA. Number one, the rise of e-commerce. Number two, the rise of China as a major economic and trading partner. Number three, the WTO, globalization of trade. And I could name probably half a dozen other things that have fundamentally shifted the global economy. So if you're just, for example, relying on statistics that just sort of do comparisons over time, like the economy is bigger, there's more trade, there's more jobs, and those sorts of things, there's going to be a very easy response to those things, or the harms, right, as well. There's going to be a very easy response, which is how do you know it was NAFTA and not one of these other, say, 20 free trade agreements, not WTO, not China, not e-commerce, or not some combination of all of them that actually did this? What evidence do you have that it was NAFTA specifically that led to this?
Yeah.
So, and I think, so what that means is you need to be choosy with your analysis and your sources, right? You need to be looking at, frankly, in this case, people who are scholarly and well sourced and well cited, and they're sort of doing what we would say is the regression analysis, right, where we consider all the different causes, and somebody who's smart with a PhD after their name isolates, here's what the impact of NAFTA was. And I will tell you that probably in future videos, I'm a big fan of people sort of crafting together their own impacts and using sort of common sense to link together different statistical arguments. I think it's a good thing, but I just think in this case, because there are so many confounding factors, so many things going on since the early 90s, and as the only person who's been here since the early 90s, I can tell you, we're a lot richer now than we were. All of us, most of us, many of us.
Yeah, Luke, are you richer now?
I don't feel rich.
Say so. I don't feel
I would
rich.
say so.
Okay, well, we're all, the world is doing better economically on the whole, I'll put it that way. So be aware of those and be selective with your data, and prefer data that lets you say, look, this gets right to the nub of whether it was NAFTA or whether it was something else. Some expert has done the regression analysis. We're not just trying to show you the economy's bigger, because those are easily taken out with confounding factors. And so with that, I thought we would spend a few minutes talking about NSDA Nationals. Two of us have been to this shindig before. I've been a bunch of times as a student, and Luke is a newcomer to debating college. He's a talented amateur. But if you have not been to NSDA before, it is not like anything else you've ever done. Right? It is not like, if you haven't been to a week-long debate tournament, it's a fundamentally different thing. And the way you prepare is different from even from the TOC. I mean, TOC is really, really tough. NCFL is really, really tough. Lots of it, the Glenbrooks and Barkley Forum, they're all very tough tournaments, but NSDA is different because it's a marathon, right? It is something where if you continue to win, you're going to be in it for many days, up to 5 days, well, up to 4 days, right? But the tournament goes 5 days. But you're going to be, hitting really good people a lot. And so, a couple of things. Number one, you got tons of time to prepare. And I would tell you that, whatever got you here, keep doing it, but do it more. If you're good at writing out blocks and preparing them, then, just spend the time you have to do that as well as you possibly can. Get up with, if you have groups that you prep with and they're willing to help you, then utilize their help.
One thing just about writing blocks, and we talked about this before we shot or anything like that. If you're just writing blocks, we want to make sure to be able to piece them together and make a cohesive story. Because that's one of the biggest things that our style of debate is. It's telling a good story and making a good narrative for your judge, because that's the easiest way for judges to go off of. Like us, we don't have that much time to prepare, but you guys, you have so much time. Try to piece it together so that way it's not just like random bits of really good information. Use the random bits of really good information as a whole.
Yeah, I think being able to pull an individual block card that you make back to whatever your narrative is good. And that actually leads to the second point, which is your judging pool at NSDA is going to look a lot like America, okay? Mm-hmm. This is nationals, but it's not. You're not going to just be judged by college debaters or coaches or high school coaches. You're going to be judged by a lot of, parents, and they're wonderful people. By the way, I'm not in any way here to bash lay judges. We like lay judges, and you need to be prepared. But you will also have coaches. You will have some of the best coaches in the country, and kids who are college debaters. All kinds of folks. It'll be a slice of America, really. And so you need to come prepared for the fact that you're going to be judged by lots of different people. And I would say that if you come into nationals with just one case prepared, you really only have yourself to blame if things don't go as well as you want. Because frankly, if you walk into a round and you see two kids sitting there wearing CITED t-shirts, right, and they've already got a flow up on their laptop, well, and you will get that sometimes in PF, that's a fundamentally different audience than, say two older folks who come in and they're nice and friendly, but they clearly are not even flowing, right? And if you're not prepared to handle that differently with a month to prepare or more, right, then, kind of that's on you, right? So I do think having different variations on the case, different variations even on some of the blocks is important.
It's not just a month. You've got a month whenever you're out of school.
Yeah,
right?
You've got a month from the time you're out of school. The other thing I'll say is, kind of correlating with that, as this is a tournament where it will be the first and only tournament on the topic, right? Unless maybe you have a few people get together and do a practice, but, it'll be the first real tournament on the topic. Which means what the meta will evolve at the tournament, because that's the only place it can. Mm-hmm. And the things that people are arguing in round 5 on day 2 will be different than the things they were arguing on day 1, right? And this goes to the idea that you have to be willing to adapt. I guarantee you that whoever wins the national final round will not be running the exact same case they ran in round 1. They just won't, because number 1, they'll get scouted, right? And number 2, they'll probably be coming up with evidence from that literally was released the night before. And number 3, they'll see what other people do and adapt. And part of this game of going to a week-long tournament is going back to the hotel room and resting and getting some relaxation in, but also learning and adapting to what. Oh, sorry, the timer down there. So it's adapting to like what has happened on that particular day, right? And so again, congratulations on making it. Do you guys have any other thoughts on like nationals, like what you do to succeed?
All I've got is someone that hasn't been to the Nationals but has some debate is that
Yeah.
it never hurts to have a good story that makes sense. At the end of the day, with a topic as complicated as trade, being coherent is really important. So make sure you're doing that.
I think that's true. I think that's important. I mean, like at the end of the day, these judges are going to be tired too, right? They're going to have judged a lot of rounds, and frankly, judges want easy ways to their ballot. And if you're telling a simple, coherent story that allows you to sort of, and your evidence is as good. If you don't have any evidence, then you're going to lose, right? But if your evidence is as good as the other side, and it's a judgment call, and your story makes sense, then you can win both ballots in that round that's being judged by a seated debater and somebody's grandma who's never seen it before, who's there out of the goodness of her heart. Mm-hmm. So yes, it's just clear stories in PF. The rounds get fast, and sometimes it boils down to who can tell a good story.
And the other thing is just kind of go off the story thing. Even if you have a ton of really great blocks, make sure you know them and know how to use them. That's going to be my last bit of advice, because we had hundreds of pages of a master file, but if we couldn't identify 90% of it, it's not very useful. So with all that being said, I think
we are about done. So anyway, thanks very much again. All of the sources we cited are down below. We really appreciate you guys watching, and we'll be coming back next year in both PF and LD to do these on a monthly basis. Also maybe doing some videos about like just good debating and good theory debating and critique debating and things like that. And Minecraft Let's Plays and Fortnite as well. So anyway, come back and see us next year. Thanks very much for your time, and we will see you soon.
And hey, good luck.
Good luck.